Well, good morning. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many people who are interested in really understanding, interested in the opportunities and really wanting to understand what's happening. And we're talking mostly US here with TNCs across the country, both what the opportunities are and what you should be knowledgeable about and maybe a little careful about in Canada as they start to expand, as you look at partnerships, and really what the best opportunities for you to partner and manage the change that's happening. So I've been really interested in this too, and I've done a lot of research to try and understand this and to look at the path forward. I'm going to present results from my current research, and I look forward to hearing your response and questions as I continue to work on it. So I'm going to ask basic questions. How big is this industry? Who does it serve? What are the traffic and transit impacts and the road forward? Starting with size, I always like to count how many, how big, where. Well, you can see there's been this tremendous growth in the for-hire sector, including TNCs and taxi cabs, since they came on the scene about 5 years ago. And some of it has come at the expense of traditional cabs, which have been cut about in half in ridership in the US. But most of it has been growth in the market. There's a whole lot more people who want to use a taxi-like service than anyone ever imagined, in fact, if you provide them with a really good, high-quality service. What this means is the TNCs have gone from being this nice little add-on, like taxis always were in the urban transportation network, to being a big player. In fact, my estimate is that by the end of this year, taxi and TNCs combined, ridership will exceed that of local buses in the United States. So it's a big number, and it will get even bigger from there. Why do people use TNCs? Well, you do have people who are leaving their own personal car at home, and the main reasons to use a TNC instead are to avoid drinking and driving, and there's been a lot of talk about that, and you see the late night peak, and because parking is expensive or difficult. So use a TNC instead of driving and paying for parking. Those are the drivers. And there's a lot of talk in the industry about, gee, our competition, John Walker said this, our competition is the private auto. Well, yes, in this context, yes. But generally speaking, there's really very little indication that beyond these two reasons to use a TNC instead of a private auto, that there's very much shift at all. And when you see where they are, you also underscore that point. So a lot of people are coming from transit. So Kevin this morning said, we don't want to see bleed from transit. Well, you do see that, and there's good reason for that, and Sharon alluded to this in her talk a minute ago. Transit is quicker, or people use TNCs because they think it's quicker and more reliable. Transit is inconvenient, more comfortable, and the like. Very basic, the things we all have known forever as to why people use one mode versus another. Adding a few more slides, maps to what Sharon showed, the most intensive uses is in downtown, dense downtown areas of America's biggest, densest, most transit-oriented cities, as you see in these maps. And I think that fits with where we sort of experience it totally as well. So in large, dense metro areas, TNC trips nationally, almost about 2/3. Let me back up. So where are the TNC trips? About 2/3 of TNC trips in 2017 were in 9 major metro areas, which I've listed there. Again, the largest, densest, most transit, most multimodal metro areas in the country. Another 10% or so were in another 11 metro areas. Think about Houston, Denver, and the like. And then the rest of the US accounted for about 20%. That's the distribution of TNC trips. The distribution of the population in the US, obviously, most people live in those other areas which have relatively low TNC trip volumes. And so the point being is that the intensive high rate of TNC ridership is in the big, dense metros and in the more urbanized, more urban central city parts of them. There's recent data out from the National Household Travel Survey that shows TNC users, not surprisingly, and other surveys have shown this, skew younger, higher income, and more educated. And so the takeaway from all this is that usage is heavier in the big multimodal cities. It's mainly affluent and educated users. There are also many occasional users who rely on TNCs for the one-off sort of trip. You take your car to the garage, and then there's a TNC to get you to work in the morning. And so there's a real opportunity here from cities to make cities easier to get around, more attractive to live in. And it's mostly what I would call an individual mobility benefit. It's good for the individual. There aren't great societal benefits as we think of transit providing, for example, providing transportation, provide sort of lifeline transportation for people who don't have any other options. Although that is part of the usage, it's not the bulk of it. So this picture looks good, and there's been a lot of enthusiasm about TNCs from when they came on the scene, and as they started to grow, people said, well, this is just a good additional option for people. And we probably wouldn't really be here talking about the issues or the concerns about them if this were 4 or 5 years ago. But we've begun to see that when you put on hundreds of thousands of additional vehicles into our major urban centers, well, they might have some traffic and transit impact. So I've looked at quite a bit at that, and here's what the research has shown. There were a series of studies published over the last year, starting with my study on sustainable about 1.5 years ago, showing that TNCs add a substantial amount of driving miles to city streets in New York, 7 major cities, which include basically the 9 that I talked to earlier, the Denver area, more recent studies in San Francisco, and the Boston area. So just a kind of a series of studies saying essentially the same thing, that you have the individual benefit for mobility, but you also have some traffic impacts. Now, it's important to note that maybe a quarter, maybe 30% of this additional miles comes at the peak. So a lot of this is late at night. We're probably less concerned about this. Some portion of it is in sort of outlying, less dense areas where traffic isn't really an issue. We're not so concerned about that. But we are concerned about rush hour traffic. And so you have 25, 30% of TNC trips are at the peak, 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. But it's also important to know that that's true of your personal vehicles as well, that about a quarter of vehicle miles is during peak hours. And so I think the takeaway from this is the TNCs contribute to traffic congestion just as the personal car does. If you look at a crowded highway, you say that's mostly caused by personal cars. TNCs are just fitting into that in the same pattern, even though much of it is also at night. So the answer from many people, the TNCs and academics and planners and many people is, well, yes, there have been impacts in terms of mileage and traffic so far, but sharing will take care of it. The Uber Pool and Lyft Line and Uber Pool Express and Lyft Shuttle and all the rest will offset these increases in traffic. So this is merely a phase along the road. So I have taken a look at this, and we now have sufficient data to evaluate, is this true? And this is really important because it should really help guide us in how we manage the growth of TNCs. So you would think that if you pool people in a trip, gee, you'll have less miles than if those people drove their personal car, and that is true. The fly in the ointment to that is that the same studies that have been done over the last year or so have shown that only 15 to 30, maybe 40% of people are coming from their own personal car. And so you're not offsetting mileage in a personal car if they would have used transit or walked or biked or not made the trip instead. And so when I kind of work through a simple model of how this looks, I look across different kinds of new mobility, and I look at bus service. And what I find is that if you have a private ride TNC, in other words, just me in the vehicle by myself, vehicle miles traveled increases by about 180%. Because that driver has to come and pick me up. That's not miles I was driving my personal vehicle, as well as take me to my destination. When you pool at the current rates of pooling, you get about 150 to 170% increase in VMT. Now, as the people on the previous panel pointed out, the pooling rates are going up. But even if you run the model and put some microtransit numbers in here, sorry, I won't go there yet. Even if you run the model with sedans and say, we'll have a lot more pooling than we have today, you always get more VMT. You can't plug numbers in and not get more VMT. So a big takeaway here is, in a sedan, even pooled, and remember, you have two people in the car, but not for the whole trip. You have a pickup at the beginning and then a pickup of the second person at the other end, some part of the trip. So maybe microtransit is part of the answer here. And I think it may be, but it depends on what the occupancy is and, of course, how many people are coming from their personal car. And just to fill out the picture, you see the VMT decrease versus personal car from bus can eliminate almost all of it. And so if you talk about high-capacity transit versus new mobility, in terms of traffic and congestion, you're much better off if you can get people on the bus, if you can provide that service and be attractive. In suburbia, there's been much less research, but there's a good study in California from UC Davis. Most suburban TNC users, it replaces the personal auto because that's the predominant mode. There are some users who would like to be multimodal. And I think there's a real opportunity in those environments to have TNCs and to think about partnerships where you're encouraging that relatively small but core nucleus of people who want a more urban lifestyle and multimodal ways of getting around in areas that are lower density. So the takeaway for traffic is that TNCs definitely contribute to traffic. I mean, this business of we're going to replace the private auto with TNCs and not reduce traffic, the numbers don't work out. They just don't work that way. And so one of the major things I want to get across is I do research and publish it this year. Last year, the theme was, hey, we've had more traffic. This year is pooling, TNCs and pooling are not going to solve it. Because if we continue to drink the Kool-Aid and think the TNC pooling is going to solve the traffic mess, it's not going to work in big cities. And we just need to accept that and move on to the next set of issues. In New York, TNCs and taxis together are 50, 60, 70% of the traffic flow. So you're saying they're not contributing to traffic. It's like, okay, let's just move on. It's both pooled and public. You see, I get a little annoyed because there's so much good stuff to do with the new mobility, but we need to move past the stuff that sounds good but doesn't pan out. So I'll try and calm down. I pledged to myself, just keep it cool. People will want to see the information, you know? I shouldn't have had that coffee. Anyway, so there's social cost. There's individual benefit, but social cost. That's the tension that we need to address in making policy. So transit impacts. So I'm sorry, you probably can't see this, but the top cities in terms that, here we are in the top metropolitan area in terms of public transportation growth in North America, Vancouver, and Seattle is the second one, I think, on this list at the top. And it's, Vancouver, and Kevin talked about this, it's doing really impressive things, and the TOD and the BRT is extremely impressive. And I walked around here this morning, and I say, well, I can see why this is working. But of course, it'll be interesting to see when the TNCs do come, if they can sustain that level of ridership growth. And in most of the country, what we've seen in big cities and small cities is ridership declines after years of growth. And we see the fingerprints of TNCs in part on this. Here's a survey from the Boston area showing, particularly among younger people, using TNCs and using transit less. So same set of studies talking about shift from TNCs to transit runs from 15% to 50% over these large, dense cities. So clearly, we're seeing that shift. We know why. We know there's lots of reasons. The transit ridership is declining. We know TNCs are a part of it. No one is saying that they're the biggest part or the only part. They're just part of the mix here. But if you're talking about, well, we're going to replace the private car, we're going to drive private car ownership down, let me tell you, there's a big study out of UCLA that shows private car ownership has been going up at the same time the TNCs have come on the scene. I've looked at data in New York City. Private car ownership is going up. So these are trends that go against the kinds of cities that we want to build and plan for and live in. And these are things that we need to deal with the reality of. So I think the takeaways from transit, the basic takeaway is very simple. Transit now has private sector competition. I actually think this is a good thing because we all know the pros, we know the good things and we know the underbelly of transit. And so part of the issue has been subsidized, not much competition. We talk about captured riders and choice riders and all the rest. Well, now there's competition. And so there's consequences. So what competition means is that there's consequences. If you don't serve the customer well, they might go someplace else. And in New York, this has been very much the dynamic and very much driving change at the gubernatorial level to do something to fix the mess. And the thing to do, and I won't go through the whole list, you know as well as I do what good transit service is, but I just want to say that the TNCs have been exemplary in putting the focus on the end-to-end customer experience. This is not about, how many people know, do you guys use the term shiny object syndrome in Canada? Right? So this is the antidote for shiny object syndrome, is if someone wants that great new station, right, or says, we have to have rail, well, think about how does that affect the end-to-end customer experience? It might be what you need, but it might be not what you need. Maybe it's more of a ribbon-cutting thing. And it's all about being quick, no hassle, transparent. I can see how long I'm going to wait, and give people a feeling of being in control. So I think the road forward, first of all, from a transit agency standpoint, is to emphasize transit's value. We wouldn't have cities if we didn't have public transportation. If everyone drives to work and shopping and leisure, you can't have the density that creates great cities. So it's essential to have transit. It's the only solution to traffic congestion. And oh, by the way, it serves all customers. You don't have to have a cell phone. You might be using a wheelchair, and it's environmentally sustainable. So there's public benefit, there's equity, there's sustainability. And we should, from a transit standpoint, always be talking about what we can provide, what we offer, the essential nature of high-capacity transit. There are really good opportunities also where new mobility can bring value. The most obvious one, and the one that you can really put some good numbers on, is where the trip volumes are very low, and paratransit is the #1 example of that. In the US, paratransit costs, what, $35 to $50 per trip. So cost avoidance, reducing costs is a really good opportunity, and the reason those costs are so high is actually that there's so few customers. There's actually, like, the demand is very spread out and very thin, and TNCs are a good fit with serving that. And then you see the very low volume sorts of situations in the really excellent presentation from Lindsay on Arlington earlier today, where here's a way on demand to serve an area that would be very difficult to serve effectively with a traditional or conventional fixed route network. But let's remember, like, the point I'd like to get across here is that Arlington figures, if I wrote them down and did a little back of the envelope more or less correctly, you know, what are we talking about? A peak ridership so far, and this will build over time, but so far, peak ridership of 360 trips in a day, right? So that's what I call low volume. Around, from my rough calculation, around 15% cost recovery. And that's not counting the amount of VC money that's in that's underwriting. Some of that, an 11-minute average wait time. So this is not like calling Uber, where the pickup is in 3 or 4 minutes. And beyond those sorts of examples, it's all being tested, it's all being piloted. We don't know what works, we don't know where the market is, we don't know how it pencils out, and we don't know what people really do or don't want to take. So the experience with that we're gaining, and Sharon talked about this, is really important and really beneficial to to everyone as we go along and see how that all pans out. So just on my last slide, I think the key directions for transit here are, or for public policy more broadly than transit, first of all, is to really emphasize the public benefit from high capacity transit backbone supplemented with new mobility. And then the individual benefit of having this option, and there's a huge individual benefit here, need two public policy responses. One is what's standardly done in terms of regulating for safety and accountability, and the other is to, in some fashion, price and regulate. On congested streets, in places like New York and San Francisco, what we're seeing is the streets are filling up with Ubers and Lyfts. We don't have room for everyone who wants to pay for their own private car and driver, and there's a lot of discussion in these cities that we'll need to do something about that. It won't be most cities that will need to do something, but the big congested ones will, and we need to figure out exactly how to do that. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to Jeff and then the discussion.